Okay, here we are. We're going to take a look at the early American life. So we're defining the time period here. I started off the time period with the Constitutional Convention because this kind of established kind of a stable government, stable society. It kind of set the tone for what the country was going to be going through over the next, 30 or 40 years. I don't have an end date here because there's not really a clear end date. You might want to think about maybe things like the end of the War of 1812, which is the kind of beginning of what's called the era of good feelings. Might be one possibility. Another possibility could be the election or the end of Jefferson's term as president. There's a few dates that you could choose here. But I kind of left that blank for right now just because of there's not one particular date that you could use. But I kind of like the end of the War of 1812 and the beginning of the era of good feelings. All right, so you'll notice here I've divided things up into some categories here. I have limited education, national culture, improved technology, and then religion, specifically the Second Great Awakening. And I have in kind of the background these themes of society and culture, including art, music, literature, religion, and kind of cultural values, what is important to people. I have exchange, which is like jobs and labor, stuff having to do with money, industrial things, agriculture, transportation technology. And then at the bottom, I have identity, race, class, and gender. Those are going to be those are kind of the three key areas when I think about identity. All right, so let's start with limited education. So the country was founded, and there's this idea of Republican motherhood that women should their part of their role was to train children to become good citizens. So it led to more education for women, but only in their role as mothers, not for professions. You'll notice down here in the contradictory characteristics, I have Judith Sargent Murray, who kind of disagreed with this idea. Her argument was essentially that women shouldn't just get education for the sake of educating their children, but to have equal education opportunities for women that could lead to other things beyond that. So she's a contradictory characteristic. She was not kind of in the majority here. In general, education was limited. It was mostly for the elite. So you have like the private academies like Exeter and then universities that were founded. There was no public funding for them. These are private schools, mostly for the elites. There was no kind of government support for public education like we would see today. There is no education for any slaves. The education for natives was limited to missionaries. Again, no public school system, but missionaries would go out, and the idea is that they're going to civilize natives. So there's a certain amount of racism there too, because it's assuming the natives are not civilized, right? And so the missionary educators were bringing education as well as let that finish, as well as the idea of um, civilization and Christianity and stuff to the natives. There wasn't a whole lot of training for professions. Doctors still use very old methods, bleeding and purging. The Brinkley textbook talks about how doctors might have actually, with bleeding and purging, might have actually done more harm than good to George Washington when he was at the end of his life. So education was limited. It was more or less kind of for elites. So education was for elites, and it kind of strengthened their hold on society. Now, in terms of national culture, this is also part of this kind of society and culture theme here. You have kind of like things that are being standardized, language and spelling. Brinkley textbook talks about the word honor. In England, it's spelled Honour. In America, it's Honor. So that is differences of making how the United States is different from other places. So Webster's dictionary was an important part of that. You also have writers like Washington Irving. He wrote kind of these American folk tales like the story of Rip Van Winkle, Ichabod Crane, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. These are all kind of stories that kind of focus on like an Americans or take place in American locations, and they represent kind of American kind of folk tales or kind of things that can be passed down from generation to generation. You also have writers promoting nationalism, right? The country is just starting off. So there's an interest to make sure that the country continues. So you kind of write books like The Life of Washington, in which he's portrayed as like this heroic figure. So national culture, in terms of stories and books and dictionaries, that sort of thing, kind of binds the nation together a little bit. Religion's another kind of unifying force in America. Early on in this time period, you have the idea of rational religion, so like deism and Unitarianism, which is this idea that God is not directly involved in the world. This is deism, and that He kind of created the world and then kind of stepped back to let people kind of do their own thing. And so what we're seeing during this time is a decline in organized churches. You think back to the First Great Awakening in the 1730s when there was an increase in denominations and stuff. This is kind of like the inevitable decline after that. But this leads to the Second Great Awakening, which is a response to the rationalism from here, right, from the 1790s. So the Second Great Awakening starts to take place in the early 1800s. And the idea is that this is different from the First Great Awakening in that the Second Great Awakening emphasizes faith and good works, like not predestination. So God didn't already have a list of people that were going to make it to heaven. You could have faith in God and you could do good things, and that could get you into heaven. So this leads to things like charities and helping orphans and that sort of thing. And this is going to be important because of the role that women played in these groups. And we'll talk more about reform movements in the future. So the Second Great Awakening was this message of equal salvation. Everybody's got an equal chance to get to heaven, because it's based on how you live your life, not on this list that God has. So you have these camp meetings of these revivals that people would attend, very similar to the ones in the First Great Awakening, where the traveling preachers would come around and people would gather and listen to these preachers. You had Black preachers that kind of like the idea of equality of salvation, right? Because they were not treated equally in this world, so at least in the next, they would have an equal chance. Women's participation in these camp meetings and revivals also has to do with equality here, and might influence the fact that orphans was like a big area in which there was an attempt to improve people's lives, right? Because children and the women's role as mothers. You also have natives. The Brinkley book talks about Handsome Lake, who was kind of a native preacher who preached anti-alcohol, anti-gambling. These are two things that had kind of helped to devastate native culture since European contact, alcohol in particular. So the Second Great Awakening is going to be important because it's about equality in some ways, right? And that's an American idea. Like, think about the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Think about Webster's dictionary here, like kind of standardizing things, making things more equal, right? So these are a couple of areas in which equality, or this kind of American ideal of equality, is kind of being promoted. Lastly, we have the improved technology here. So this is the kind of beginning of the industry in America. You have Samuel Slater, who comes to America and he kind of memorizes the first plans for the first kind of mill or modern factory, and he opens that in Rhode Island, so in the New England area in the north. And then you have this really significant invention, the cotton gin. Like, it's pretty much impossible to overstate how important this invention was, both to the South and the North. It helped the South because it allowed cotton to greatly expand its growth. You could grow cotton not just along the coastal areas, but inland and all throughout the South. So cotton production expanded greatly. And this also led to the development of the textile industry in the North. Textiles are when you take cotton and you turn it into thread and cloth, that sort of thing. So this is that industrialization of the North that begins to occur here. And this is going to be hugely important for the economy of the United States. And you can see how the North kind of depends on the South to supply cotton. This is going to have major effects later when we talk about the issue of slavery. You also have technology like the steamboat. So the steamboat would allow people to move around the country on rivers against the current, so it could improve transportation. And in terms of roads, you have turnpikes that are being built. These are toll roads. However, they're very limited and mostly just between populated areas. Okay, so those are some general categories about what early American life was like. In terms of the contradictory characteristics, I mentioned Judith Sargent Murray. The West had very limited transportation aspects. So these are all kind of things that in American life that kind of shaped how things were going. All right, see you next time.